in a fortress of grey stone, somewhere deep in the winter of France. The year is 1396. Candles flicker along the cold walls, their flames dancing whenever the wind sneaks through the cracks behind old, heavy tapestries. The castle is quiet, but not in peace, in preparation. There's a heaviness in the air, like something sacred and terrible is about to happen. In one of the upper chambers, high above the great hall, stands a girl, barely more than a child. Her name is Isabelle of Valois, though the world will come to call her many things: princess, queen, symbol, and victim. She's 12 years old. Tonight, she is being dressed for her wedding. No, not just a wedding. Something colder, something calculated. She does not speak. She doesn't cry. Not because she isn't afraid, she is. But she's been trained from the moment she could walk to endure without complaint. Her ladies brush her long brown hair until it glows like polished chestnut. They murmur prayers under their breath, words meant to bless her or maybe protect her, though no blessing would be enough for what waits on the other side of tonight. They dress her in white, a linen shift, thick and rough, swallowing her small frame. The veil they place on her smells of lavender and candle wax. Her tiny fingers clutch the edge of it, but she doesn't ask questions. She's learned by now that in her world, obedience is safer than curiosity. Outside the walls, the wind howls like a beast. Inside, the castle is full of people, but Isabelle has never felt more alone. Downstairs in the hall, her husband waits, King Richard II of England. He is 29 years old, a man weathered not just by war but by mourning. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died 2 years earlier. He loved her deeply, more than a king was expected to love. Her death broke something in him, and though the people dressed in black, though the court wept on command, no one mourned her like he did. For weeks, he wandered through the palace like a ghost. But kings, even grieving ones, don't get to live in sadness forever. Peace demanded a sacrifice, so France and England came to terms, and their peace treaty was sealed not by parchment, but by Isabelle, 12 years old and handed over like an offering. She wasn't chosen for her charm, or her mind, or even her beauty. She was chosen because she had royal blood and an unbroken womb. This marriage, if you could call it that, was a contract, a cold, bloody signature between two crowns. And that signature had to be verified, not just once, but for 7 days. 7 days of confinement, 7 days of scrutiny, 7 days of bedding. A word that sounds soft, but in this chamber it means imprisonment. Isabelle knows none of this in detail yet, only whispers, only strange silences from her ladies when they speak of what happens after the feast. She can feel it in her bones. Something wrong, something irreversible. The wedding itself is a spectacle. November 1396, gold cloth, jeweled goblets, choirs that echo through the cathedral. Bishops and ambassadors fill the hall, their faces carved from stone. Nobody looks at Isabelle like a child. They look at her like a receipt, proof that the deal has gone through. When the last goblet is drained, when the final hymn has died out, the real ceremony begins. They take her hand. They lead her through corridors lit by fire. They bring her to a door, tall, thick, carved with the lion and the fleur-de-lis. She walks in. The guards close the door behind her, and history becomes real. What happened next is not a myth. It is not metaphor. It was recorded by doctors, priests, royal scribes. Not for beauty, not for poetry, but for verification. This is the first night of 7, and there is no escape. The room was colder than she expected. Not just from the stone walls or the open windows that let the wind slip through, but from something deeper, a silence so heavy it made her chest tighten. A fire burned low in the hearth, throwing long, soft shadows across the walls. The bed in the center of the room was enormous, draped in red velvet and trimmed with golden thread. It looked more like an altar than a place to sleep. Isabelle stood still, just inside the doorway, her bare feet pressing into the rough floor. She didn't know whether to move forward or wait. No one had told her what to do next. Or maybe they had, and she'd forgotten in the storm of whispers and prayers that had filled her ears all day. And then King Richard entered. He said nothing at first. He didn't rush toward her, didn't smile. He just stood there in his black velvet robe, the silver thread catching the firelight like a blade. His face, handsome once perhaps, was pale and tired, his eyes sharp and hollow. He looked at Isabelle not like a man greeting his bride, but like a soldier staring at the battlefield he never asked to cross. She lowered her gaze the way she'd been taught. He walked past her slowly, like the room itself was watching him. Behind her, the door opened again. 2 priests stepped inside, then a nobleman from the English court and another from France. A physician, old and silent, trailed behind them, carrying a small leather book. Isabelle had never seen so many people enter a bedchamber at once. No one said a word to her. They spoke around her, over her, in Latin and French and English, words about honor, alliance, tradition, words that dressed cruelty in ceremony. Then came the worst part, the stripping, not violent, not fast, but cruel in its patience. Her attendants stepped forward with shaking hands. They pulled away her veil, her shift, layer by layer, until she stood bare under candlelight. 12 years old, naked in front of strangers. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she didn't cry. Crying was dangerous. Crying made them think you were weak. Crying gave them permission. She climbed into the bed as told. The sheets were cold. King Richard followed. He didn't touch her at first. He simply lay beside her, eyes on the ceiling, as the priests recited Latin prayers that made her skin crawl. And then the others waited for the act to begin, because this wasn't a night of privacy. It was a recorded performance. The royal physician stepped closer after some time. Isabelle heard the soft crackle of pages turning. He wrote something in his book. Then he stepped back. 2 servants brought in warm wine and bread. Richard didn't take any. Isabelle's stomach turned at the sight of food. They were left alone then, for now. The door shut behind the last noble. Silence returned, but it was different now, tighter, like the walls were breathing. Richard sat up. He looked at her, and for the first time he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, voice hoarse. "This isn't how it should be." His words meant nothing, or maybe they meant everything. Because what came next wasn't love. It wasn't even desire. It was duty, mechanical, careful, observed. He didn't hurt her, not the way she feared, but the act itself, the violation of her youth, her safety, her body, was more than pain. It was the death of something invisible inside her, something she didn't know she had until it was gone. Hours passed, then the door creaked again. The physician returned. This time, he pulled back the sheets and examined her. Cold hands, no apologies. She didn't understand what he was looking for. When he found blood on the linens, he nodded once and wrote more notes in his book. He left without a word. The next morning, the same men would return, and the day after that, and the next, for 7 days. No escape, no silence, no privacy. This wasn't a wedding. This was a siege. The morning light didn't bring comfort. Only more eyes. Before dawn had fully broken, footsteps echoed outside the chamber. The first to arrive were the priests, their eyes bleary but resolute. They entered without knocking. Their presence no longer startled Isabelle. She had learned quickly that this room did not belong to her. Her body did not belong to her. Not during these 7 days. The air smelled of wax and sweat. The sheets were wrinkled and stained, and Isabelle's limbs ached from the cold and from the weight of lying still for so long. The bed was wide, but it felt like a coffin. King Richard had already risen. He dressed slowly, methodically, his expression unreadable. He hadn't touched her again after the first night. He spoke little, ate less. He stayed because he had to, not as a husband, but as a participant in a ritual too monstrous to refuse. The physician arrived with his leather-bound book and a new linen cloth. He pulled the sheets aside again. Isabelle flinched. His hands were not rough, but they were unkind. He inspected her thighs, her stomach, the inside of her arms. He took note of bruising, of color, of warmth. It wasn't medicine. It was accounting. He wrote, "Sanguis confirmatus," evidence of blood confirmed. Then, without even glancing at her face, he stepped back, closed his book, and turned toward the others. The nobleman nodded, as though a trade deal had been signed. No one looked at her. Isabelle closed her eyes. She wasn't allowed to leave the bed. Not for meals, not for prayers. The attendants brought trays, fruits, broth, soft bread, but she barely touched them. Hunger had become distant, irrelevant. Outside the chamber, the castle continued its rhythm. Bells rang, servants swept, soldiers patrolled the gates. But none of it reached her. Her world had shrunk to a single bed, a single room, a single purpose. On the second night, the ritual repeated. More prayers, more inspection, more silent judgment. King Richard returned just before the sun dipped below the horizon. He smelled of horse sweat and rose water, as if trying to disguise the fact that he'd been riding hard across the hills outside the fortress. He sat at the edge of the bed but didn't speak. "I won't hurt you," he said finally. "They require signs. I'll give them what they need." His voice was tight, detached. Not cruel, but cold in a way that was worse. Isabelle didn't answer. She didn't cry. The tears had dried somewhere deep inside her, buried under the weight of her new role. Child no longer. Not wife either. Just evidence. They lay together again. The physician returned later. He examined her once more, whispering to himself in Latin. The bruises were darker now. Her body was adjusting, he noted. He took her pulse. He touched the underside of her chin. He scribbled it all down like she was some animal being studied. By the third day, she had stopped noticing the faces. She kept her eyes on the ceiling during the examinations, on the tiny cracks in the stone, the flicker of the candlelight, the soft drift of smoke. Anything that would keep her from looking at the men whose job was to watch her suffer. The guards outside rotated every 4 hours. Sometimes she heard them laugh. Once one of them played a lute quietly during the evening shift. The notes drifted through the cracks in the chamber door like a ghost of a world she used to know. But laughter was for other people now. Music belonged to someone else. By the end of the third day, the physician recorded the first signs of bodily harmony. His phrase, for what the medieval world believed, was evidence of potential conception. It was not true, of course. Her body was too young, too small, too terrified. But the idea of pregnancy was a requirement, and if the facts did not match, then the facts would be bent until they fit. On the fourth morning, Isabelle woke up to blood on her pillow, not from her womb, but from her nose. It had bled during the night. She hadn't even noticed. One of the attendants saw it and quietly wiped it away. "She's adjusting," the woman whispered to the physician. He nodded and wrote another line. No one asked Isabelle how she felt. No one ever did. By the fourth night, Isabelle had learned how to disappear without leaving the bed. She could fold herself into silence so deep it made her heart feel like it was beating in someone else's chest. She could lie so still that even the flickering candlelight seemed to move more than she did. In her mind, she was somewhere far away, somewhere where nobody measured her worth in bleeding sheets or judged her value through the notes of a royal physician. But the body always betrayed the mind, eventually. That night, the pain returned, not sudden, not sharp, just a low, constant ache that sat behind her ribs and pressed against her spine. Her chest felt tight, her legs numb. Her wrists ached where she gripped the sheets each time the door creaked open. King Richard did not touch her that evening. He sat in the chair by the fire, robe open, crown resting heavy on the nearby table. His eyes watched the flames, not her. Isabelle glanced at him once and caught something strange in his face. Not desire, not indifference, but maybe guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. "I don't want to be here," she whispered suddenly, barely able to hear herself say it. Richard didn't respond right away. The fire cracked. The logs shifted. "Neither do I," he said finally. But neither of them moved. They couldn't. The guards outside paced back and forth. Inside, the priests entered, bowed, and spoke their nightly blessings. Words about unity, obedience, and God's will. It was the same routine every night now. Their voices droned like insects, and Isabelle stopped hearing the meaning behind them. When they left, the physician entered again, now with a second book, larger and heavier. He didn't even glance at her face anymore. He inspected her hips this time, made notes about developmental pace. He examined her hands, her throat. He checked her temperature, her heartbeat, the bruises on her thighs. He sniffed the sheets. He sniffed them like a dog searching for a scent. Isabelle wanted to scream, but screaming would only bring more attention, more whispers, more touches disguised as concern. So she stayed silent. The physician spoke with King Richard after. Quietly in Latin, the king nodded. He didn't look at Isabelle again that night. They left a fresh tray of food on the table. Roasted quail, honeyed figs, warm milk with spices. She didn't touch it. Her stomach had shriveled into something hollow. The food looked like it belonged in a feast for someone else. Someone older, someone whole. That night she bled again. Just a little, but enough for the sheets to stain. She saw it in the morning light, bright red against the cream-colored linen. The physician came early and nodded in satisfaction. "It continues," he said. "This is promising." He dipped his fingers into the blood and examined it between thumb and forefinger, then wiped them clean on the inside of her discarded shift. Isabelle said nothing. She just stared at the ceiling, counting the stones above her bed. 18 full squares, 2 half-cracked ones, a water stain in the shape of a horse's head. That was her world now. Richard left early that morning, speaking not a single word. She heard him telling the guard to post new men at the door. One of the English nobles asked if everything was progressing. "It is," Richard said, his voice like dust. "Enough to satisfy them." On the 5th day, Isabelle did not speak at all. Not to her maids, not to the priest who brought her a rosary, not to the French ambassador who slipped a small glass vial into her hands, filled with what he called blessed oil for strength. She didn't use it. She didn't care. She didn't feel human anymore. She was a womb with a crown, nothing more. When the physician checked her again that afternoon, she didn't flinch. When he pulled back the covers, she didn't react. When he touched her too long, pressing down on her abdomen as if searching for seeds in the soil, she didn't move. She didn't exist. Not the way real people do. Only 2 days remained. But time didn't matter. 2 days was 2 lifetimes. She counted the stones again, 18 full. 2 cracked. 1 stain, same as always. Everything changed around her. But the ceiling stayed the same. By the 6th night, the chamber felt smaller than it had on the 1st. The walls seemed to lean inward, as if the castle itself wished to watch her more closely. The velvet canopy over the bed hung low and heavy, trapping the air like a curtain of smothered breath. Even the fire seemed to burn weaker, its glow sinking instead of shining. Isabelle's body was no longer her own. It belonged to ritual, to witnesses, to expectation. The bruises had turned yellow along the edges, lavender in the center like pressed violets rotting on pale skin. She did not bother to cover them anymore. She had stopped asking why on the 3rd day. She stopped feeling shame by the 4th. She stopped feeling anything by the 6th. The priests entered again, as always, right before dusk, their words dry as sand. They prayed while looking at the floor, never at her face. They were not here to bless her, only the proof of her usefulness. When they left, King Richard returned, slow and distant. His hair was slightly damp from the mist outside. He smelled faintly of iron and pine, the scent of someone who wished he had stayed in the stables rather than climbing the stairs to this room. He didn't sit beside her this time. He stood by the window, hand resting on the stone frame. "You should sleep," he said, voice low. "I don't sleep anymore," Isabelle answered. It was the first thing she'd said in 2 days. Richard hesitated. The silence between them was thick, unfamiliar. Then he said something she did not expect. "I asked them to shorten it," he murmured. "They refused." She turned her head slightly, not enough to meet his eyes. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Because I am peace." He paused, then nodded once. "You are a proof that peace exists," he said. Not gently, not cruelly, just truthfully. Proof, not person. He did not touch her that night. The ritual had become too heavy even for him. He knew what the scribes would mark down in their ledgers. They would not care whether the king actually touched his child bride again. only that blood and closeness had been recorded. At midnight the door opened again. The physician, he came with a basin of water, not to wash her, but to inspect again the body that was no longer hers. He pressed 2 fingers against her lower belly, slow and deliberate, as if searching for the future. "Favorable warmth," he said aloud for the record. Richard closed his eyes. Isabelle did not speak, but something shifted in her then, something small and sharp, like a splinter sliding deeper into the flesh. She realized all at once that no matter what happened next, a part of her would never come back. She would grow older. She would learn languages and prayers and courtly manners. Someday she might even become queen in truth, but the child who walked into this room on the wedding night, she was already gone. It was the morning of the 7th day when her hands began to shake, not from fear that had burned away long ago, but from exhaustion so heavy it sat inside her bones. She could not lift the cup the attendants gave her. One of them had to hold it to her lips. The door opened again at first light. The guards changed shifts. More eyes, more waiting. Outside, the sky was the color of cold steel. Inside, the bedding ritual was one day from ending. Just one more night, one more inspection, one more humiliation, one more day of proving she was useful enough not to be discarded. Her fate was nearly sealed. Her childhood was already buried. Tomorrow, she would walk out of this room alive, but not whole. The 7th night did not feel like an ending. It felt like a sentence being stamped instead of spoken. Final, silent, irreversible. By now, Isabelle no longer startled when the door opened. She no longer flushed when unfamiliar hands touched her. She no longer winced at words like verification or fulfillment. Her body had learned to survive by shutting itself inward. The world could do whatever it wished outside her skin. Her spirit had gone somewhere unreachable. The chamber was warm from the fire, but she still felt cold. It was a cold that lived in the marrow, beneath the bruises and ceremony. A cold that came from knowing she was property, not bride. The guards had been changed again, fresh and alert for the final night. The nobles gathered outside, waiting for the last inspection. She could hear muffled voices through the thick oak door. French voices, English voices. 2 kingdoms leaning forward like wolves, watching a lamb breathe its last. Even now, she did not cry, not because she was strong, but because tears would make it real. When King Richard entered for the final evening, he did not come as a king looked at in legend. No crown, no jewels, no glory. Just a tired man with hollow eyes, young enough to still feel grief, old enough to understand that nothing in this chamber would ever leave him. Clean. He sat at the edge of the bed and looked at Isabelle. For the first time in days, really looked. "You should never have been given to me," he said quietly. "This was not meant for a child." His voice cracked halfway through. Isabelle did not know what comfort was supposed to sound like, but this did not feel like comfort. It felt like truth, too late to matter. "You did not want this," she whispered. "I wanted peace," he replied. "But not this price." They both fell silent. 2 prisoners in the same sentence, one trapped by crown, the other trapped by youth. When the priests entered again, Isabelle stared forward as they prayed. They were quicker than usual. Even ritual grows tired of itself. The physician followed right after, carrying a different ledger this time, the final record. He didn't ask permission. He didn't speak to her. He never had. He simply touched her body again, pushed the gown aside, checked for what he called signs of receptive change, a polite phrase for pain and tearing, and then nodded to himself with clinical satisfaction. "Completion confirmed," he said. "A human sentence, reduced to paperwork." Richard closed his eyes as if he wished to disappear inside himself. The priest wrote down the physician's words. The nobleman signed. The physician sealed the ledger. That was all peace required. Not prayer, not love, not blessing. Blood, signatures, and a child who could not say no. When they left, the chamber door closed slowly, heavy, final. And for the first time in 7 days, silence wasn't a threat. It was grief. Their week together ended not with tenderness or closeness, but with emptiness, a space so wide it might as well have been a grave between them. In the hours before dawn, a soft snow began to fall outside the fortress walls. The guards whispered about it in the hallway, calling it a blessing, a sign from heaven, a peaceful omen. But inside, Isabelle lay awake, hollow, small, broken in a way no one would ever be allowed to name. 7 days, 1 bed, no escape, not a marriage, a taking. By sunrise, servants arrived with gowns and jewels to prepare her to walk out in public again. They would paint her cheeks to hide the pallor. They would braid her hair and call her radiant. They would tell the world she was honored, chosen, cherished. She would smile because she had to, because queens are made from obedience long before they are made from crowns. And tomorrow, history would call her wife. But God knew she had only ever been proof. After the 7th night, the chamber did not feel like a room anymore. It felt like a shell she had shed. But leaving it did not make her free. It only moved her from one kind of captivity to another, more public and far more polished. The attendants arrived at dawn with hot water and perfumed cloths. They spoke gently but not kindly, softness without soul. They wiped her down as though they were scrubbing away sin, not injury. They did not look her in the eye. Even pity was forbidden here. Pity acknowledged wrongness, and wrongness could not exist in a ritual the church itself had blessed. They dressed her in fresh linen and layered silk over her shoulders, violet and gold, the colors of royal legitimacy. The gown was heavy, too heavy for her narrow back. The embroidery scratched her skin. The jewels pressed into her collarbones like bits of ice. When they placed the miniature crown onto her head, not the great coronation crown, but the ceremonial marriage circlet, she almost laughed. It was so light compared to everything else she had been forced to carry. Outside, the snow had stopped. The courtyard below glistened in pale morning sunlight. It should have been beautiful. But beauty meant nothing to someone who had gone numb. The door opened, and the French ambassador stepped in. He looked at her not with sympathy but satisfaction. She had done her duty, or rather, her body had done it for her. And that was all France needed. "You have brought honor to your house," he said, but honor did not feel like anything. He offered his arm and led her from the chamber. The halls felt different than before, taller, colder, filled with whispers she could no longer decode. Every noble they passed bowed, not to Isabelle the child, but to Isabelle the treaty. She realized, walking through those corridors, that she had already disappeared from her own life. The girl who used to run in palace gardens, who learned her letters beside fountain pools, who pressed flowers into books and giggled with her maids, she lived in memories now. Or maybe she no longer lived at all. They brought her to the great hall, where both English and French dignitaries waited to view her, because after 7 days, she was no longer just a bride, she was evidence completed. The king sat beside her on the dais. He did not touch her. He did not look at her. He stared straight ahead, like a man seated before judgment. A priest stood and read aloud from the physician's ledger, a clinical description of the successful bedding. The words washed over the court like a blessing, though they sounded more like inventory. 7 days, 7 signatures, 7 entries of flesh turned into politics. When the priest finished, applause broke out. Applause, like the end of a performance, Isabelle did not feel clapped for. She felt presented, displayed like a contract that had been stamped and sealed. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap and stared at the far wall, where a tapestry showed St. Margaret emerging from the belly of a dragon, a symbol of purity untouched, unbroken. The irony might have made her smile if her mouth remembered how. After the ceremony, she was escorted away to rest, not to recover. Recovery was a word for someone whose well-being mattered. She was simply being preserved, like a relic put back into safekeeping. King Richard joined her hours later in a smaller withdrawing room, away from the crowd. He stood by the window again, always near an exit that was never truly an exit. "They will send word to Paris tonight," he said quietly. Your father will be told you fulfilled your role. Role, not marriage, not union. Role like she was playing a part in a play she never auditioned for. And now, Isabelle asked, her voice flat. Now, Richard exhaled slowly. Now we pretend this is what it means to be joined. He did not sound victorious. He sounded exiled inside his own crown. She turned her head to him. For the first time in all those awful days, her gaze was steady. Will they come again? She asked. The physicians. The priests. No, he said. It is finished. Finished, but not undone. He hesitated, then added, You will have chambers of your own now, and tutors, ladies-in-waiting. You will be treated as a future queen must be, as a symbol, as a bargaining chip, as a vessel to be guarded until old enough to be opened again, not as a girl, not as a human being. I will not touch you again, he said after a long silence. Not until you are a woman grown. To another life, that might have sounded like mercy. Here it sounded like a reprieve before the next siege. Isabelle nodded once. She did not thank him. A prisoner does not thank the warden for a softer chain. She simply folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window, past the courtyard, past the frost, past the horizon itself, to a place where her spirit had gone ahead of her. Outside, the banners of England and France fluttered side by side in the winter wind, a truce woven from a child's body. Peace, bought like a commodity, and once the hall emptied and the ink dried, history would remember the treaty, but not the girl who was sacrificed to make it real. When the celebration was over and the witnesses returned to their duties, Isabelle was led through corridors she had never seen before, the private wing reserved for queens and royal heirs. Her feet moved on instinct, small steps hidden beneath brocade so heavy her legs trembled beneath it. The gown whispered against the floor with every step, like silk trying to swallow her whole. They brought her to a chamber with tall windows and carved beams, painted with fleur-de-lis. There were cushions of velvet, tapestries of hunting scenes, and a gold-edged mirror taller than she was. It looked like a place designed for comfort, but comfort is useless to someone who no longer inhabits herself. The ladies assigned to her bowed low, their faces polite but unreadable. They arranged her hair, removed her shoes, sat her on a cushioned bench. One of them placed a cup of spiced milk in her hand and called her Your Grace, in a tone that sounded like performance rather than respect. No one said, Are you in pain? No one said, Are you frightened? No one said, You are still a child. In this world, her childhood had already been erased from the record. Later that evening, when she was finally left alone, she went to the window and looked out across the courtyard. Fresh snow coated the stone, like a thin veil of innocence the world did not deserve. She tried to remember the little girl who used to believe princes existed to protect princesses. That child felt like someone she had read about once, not someone she had been. Down below, servants loaded wagons with parchment-bound ledgers, the official records of the bedding. They would travel across kingdoms, copied and archived, proof that peace had been sealed through her body. Evidence could be transported. A human soul could not. She tried to pray, not from piety, from instinct. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. Heaven had felt far away for 7 days. Now it felt unreachable. The door opened again sometime after dusk. She did not turn. She already knew who it was from the silence. Richard carried silence with him like a cloak. You will not be asked to endure that again, he said. She did not thank him. Kindness would have been release. This was only postponement. You are to have a retinue, he continued, a governess, tutors, musicians. You will be treated with honor. Honor, a prettier word for captivity. She kept her eyes on the snow. After a moment, he spoke again. Quieter. They will think you are fortunate. She finally turned her head, slowly, as if the motion cost her something. Am I? She asked. Richard had no answer. A king who could face war, rebellion, famine, and diplomacy had no defense against the truth spoken by a child. He left without ceremony, without reassurance, without goodbye. He did not look back. When the door closed, the room felt larger than before, not with freedom, but with emptiness. She walked to the great mirror and stood before it, staring. A jeweled circlet rested on her brow. Silk draped her shoulders. Her cheeks were powdered, her lips tinted rose. She looked like a queen in miniature, a doll made lifelike by suffering. But her eyes were centuries older than her bones. Outside, bells rang for evening prayers. Inside, a girl stood alone, not sleeping, not weeping, simply existing in the aftermath of being claimed. History would remember the treaty. It would celebrate the truce. It would praise the diplomacy. Not one line would mention her shaking hands, or the blood on the sheets, or the childhood left on a cold stone bed. Years later, when she returned to France as a widow, still barely grown, people would speak of her grace, her chastity, her poise. They would call her unspoiled. They would not understand the cruelty of that word. Not spoiled, but emptied. 7 days. One bed, no escape, not a wedding, not a joining, not a union, a sacrifice performed in silk. And when the snow melted outside the fortress walls, the last trace of her childhood melted with it, erased, like footprints in winter. But the silence she carried from that chamber would never thaw. If this story moved you, don't scroll past. Like this video to honor the forgotten. To share it so more people know the truth hidden behind crowns and ceremony. And subscribe for more stories history tried to silence.